Hey folks, hey Uni Rock, hit it Brizzy. Okay, so not busy, this is Brizzy. Um, gonna look at Wonderland. Sorry, I don't have the graphics that Uni Rock has, and I don't know if he's gonna watch this or not, but it's gonna be a little bit long-winded. I intend to make it kind of exciting. There's gonna be potential vampires, deep conspiracies, 2012 phenomena. Try to keep it as grounded as I can here, but that stuff isn't very grounded. But it is the life that I experienced in some sense. You might, when these sorts of ideas are thrown around, you got to question the person's integrity, and that's understandable. So if you just hear me out, if you want to, you'll get to the bottom, hopefully get to the bottom of where I'm coming from here. So the beginnings are kind of hard to really dig into because it's not, there wasn't an exact beginning to it. But I'll start with sort of a girlfriend that I had, because it all interweaves, and that's the very, very strange thing about it, leading up in into approximately 2012 when I went totally mad. But there was an individual, she was from Iran, and she was over in Vancouver where I was living, or near where I was living. I was in Squamish, BC, which is just north of Vancouver. And she was studying, well, it was kind of biochemistry at a high level. I didn't really understand the particulars. She was doing her doctoral, work. It was very, very technical. I helped her write a few papers. The English, I had some English teaching background and so forth, so I helped her do some of that. It's now kind of drifting from my mind, some of the peculiarities about it, but it was very, very peculiar. I wrote a book about this a couple years ago called Wonderland, of all things. There's a lot of cross-correlations between Unirock's recent work and what I'm going to try to lay out here. So PSYOPs and stuff could very easily be in play with what went down, and I'm not sure. I still have many question marks about it. But so this individual, this girl, again, she was studying high-level chemistry, and there was a big cultural rift, right? That's just the nature of things when you're dating somebody from, a Middle Eastern country, and you have never been there or really understand a lot of the kind of cultural frameworks from which they, base their beliefs. To a large degree, I tried to understand a little bit, but so, she would say some weird things to me occasionally. She'd say things like, you're Jesus, you're very much like Jesus, and things like that. But she would always kind of want me to take her shopping, and, I won't get into the details too much, the minutia about it, but there was one day, and this is where it kind of really started to get weird, where we were at a park, and she puts her hand around me, and she says, "I can feel you." And as soon as that happened, my heart started to go sporadic, and then she took her hand off, and she did it again, and it really went wild that time, and I almost, fell to my knees. I didn't, correlation isn't causation, it's just something that happened, and I noted it. It was really weird, and it was painful for a minute, but yeah, so that happened, and I thought maybe I have some heart issues or something, because that's very possible, just cardiac, and that could still be the case. But let's get into this a bit more. So as we continue to date, she she started to do some very weird things, and it kind of tripped me up. One thing that was really weird is I was at the library with her one day, and she brought a book over. I was just sitting there reading. She brought a book over, and it was like vampires. And she opened up the book, and she's like, "I'm like them." I think that's her words. It was something along those lines. And I was like, "What?" And she just kind of stared at me for a few minutes. And I was like, okay. I took the book and I put it back on the shelf. I didn't really want to have anything to do with that so much. There was a few other weird things in and around that time. I can't remember the particulars, but they were starting to strange me out. It's a few things just like that. And then one day, she left her Facebook on, and because she was kind of weirding me out, I know it was just a terrible thing to do, but I went on to her Facebook account and I started looking around. So one of the things that I found out was that she was friends with the Prince of Iraq, or the Prince of Iran, pardon me. She had like a pretty good relationship with him, it seemed, maybe even sexual. It was pretty close. And he, I guess, if I understood the emails right, he actually visited there, and he might have even been there, if I remember right, at the time I was reading those emails. I think that's the case, but I'm not 100%. It's been a while again. And so another weird thing that I noticed on her Facebook account was that there was all these people that she was with, right? So it was usually just a single guy in a location, and she would snap a photo, and it would just be put on her account. And I noticed that before about it. I noticed that she had been doing that on her Facebook account. There'd be like a single guy, and there'd be a shot of him. And it kind of got me wondering, because I met her on a dating site, and it's like maybe she's dating multiple people at once. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility. And so there was multiple pictures like that. There was like 5 or 6 of them. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. So there was like multiple pictures like that where there was a guy alone and she just took a scenic background photo. When I was on the Facebook account, I noticed that she was talking with the prince about those people. So she was saying, in essence, okay, this one's gone. We don't have that one anymore. And things like that. And it really started to get me worried with the connections that I was starting to link into my brain about what she was like, the vampire stuff. I was maybe overstretching, I was like, this is really weird. What's the prince? And I did some research into the background of the prince, and it got me scared too. So that stuff was all weighing on me. And then I started noticing like a black car that was like following me, it seemed, the same license plate. Noticed it like trailing me sometimes when I was walking, because I lived in a small town, Squamish, BC, and so I noticed that, and then we had a big break-in into this kind of compound facilities that I was living in, and it wasn't the first time we actually had been broken into, so I got to make that clear. We lived next to, the compound was next to an Aboriginal reserve, wherein there was a few break-ins in the past, and they would steal machinery and these sorts of things from the compound. In this particular case, though, they broke into my car, and they stole I think they stole a few CDs, but there was nothing else gone. And they did, I think, get into the compound facility, which was particularly weird, which is where I live, and there's really nothing in there, but that's maybe not entirely true. Maybe they saw something in my room that they wanted, but so I was starting to get, I would say, on the edge of paranoid at that point. I had a sailboat, so I one night, in sort of an extreme state, I got to admit, and so this is and needs to be taken into account. When you're in an extreme state, your mind is not working quite the way it ought to. So I can't necessarily say this was not just a massive ball of confusion and such, because that's very possible. But it does, a lot of weird things happened in this ball of confusion, so if that's what it was. So I was on the boat, lying down, not on my bed, but on sort of it's kind of a secondary bed. You can pull it out to be a bed. It's on the side, and I kind of boarded up the place. You know, I was on the edge of paranoid, I'd say. That night, I was nearly sleeping, and I heard somebody starting to walk across the top of the boat, and I just froze. You know, I was like, "What?" You know, it's in a compound, locked up, and there's nobody out there really, or there's nobody supposed to be out there. Again, it's possible that there was somebody breaking in again, but that's about the only real possibility that I can think of that makes sense to me, other than what I will present to you in a few moments. So it sounded like this individual walked up to the edge of the boat where I would typically be sleeping. So at the far end, like at the, I forget my boat terminology. There's I can't remember it. When you sit at the front of the boat, or sleep at the front of the boat, that's where he would have stood, right at the edge of the boat at the front. And I all of a sudden heard like creaking. It was like, and it was like, I don't know how to put it. So a voice in my head all of a sudden came through, and it said, "He's got you. He's got your heart." And I could feel this. It was like a hand going through my body into my heart and like pressing it. And then it opened, and then it would press, and then it would open. And what it was doing is it felt like it was giving me a heart attack. Again, this could be totally just a psychological phenomenon. I gotta say that. But it was very, very odd, and I could hear the cracking in a very loud way right through the night. And it kept happening, and I felt like I was going to die, like over and over again, probably 50 times. Just a terrible, terrible experience. And there was a few other things that I can't quite recall, but eventually what happened is it was like I broke the hand, and it shattered out my back, and there was like a vast opening out behind my back. Very, very weird, mystical, in my opinion, experience that finally kind of came out of it. And there was a few things that seemed mystical in a certain sense that led up to this too. A few sort of like what might be called visionary experiences or just lucid dreams. Some of them were waking, some weird things like that. You know, these are things that I had been thinking about, so you're kind of primed for it. And that's, you know, from a philosophic vantage point, from an epistological point of view, you know, what you know and how you know it is very much tied up in many respects with you know, the kinds of constructs that you build yourself around. So I got to take that as a real thing here. Okay, so I made it through that. I lived through it, and that was great. There were a few occasions after that where it seemed like there was somebody still following me in a car. My paranoia did drop off quite a bit, but it was still there. I was still worried about things, and but it kind of primed up again when I had this sort of lucid dream. And I got to recall exactly how it went. I had wrote it down vividly in the book. It was to do with, I think, well, there was a snake dream. One of the snake dreams, I'll just reenact the snake dream, was that there was like a snake was part of my back, and it had sort of eaten everybody, but then I finally pulled it off, and I kind of, when I was looking at it, I realized the snake was sort of part of me too. Not a good, maybe necessarily omen, but it was also a sense in which by pulling it off your back, there is a reveal or a fact that you are not necessarily bound to it either. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You both recognize it, and you recognize that it's not necessarily something you need to identify with. So part of an identification problem, potentially. So this ties into a few things. I'm just going to get into that philosophic aspect of this. This is going to run over 30 minutes, I think, for sure. And it'll have to be done in two 30-minute sections. So the idea behind this is that there's a theory, and I've mentioned it to Unirock before, called spiral dynamics. And it is critical and important to understanding where I'm coming from in this next phase of the story. So I'm going to lay that out, and this will come tie together, I think, in important ways. So if you bear with me. So in essence, this theory is about 8 developmental waves or stages that are laid out in sort of an empirical map by a man named Claire W. Graves. Again, every scientist has their flaws, and every empirical study is not necessarily perfectly mapped in a scientifically rigorous fashion and so forth, but it's a fairly well-regarded map to many people, and it deals mostly with value systems. And there's other people that work on other things such as cognition and morals and these sorts of things, and they have these kinds of cross correlates, but this particular system is probably the easiest to get into to kind of explain this. So this particular theory, says that there's an exponential trend of development that started probably 100,000 years ago, potentially thereabouts, if our history is right. And there's lots of question marks about that, and I have certain qualms, and but starting with early tool-making people into, that was like 100,000 years ago, that were focused more on survival and so forth, to magical people where they thought they could put on an animal mask and sort of imbibe the magical qualities of that animal, and this is kind of tribalistic and these sorts of things. And then as we march forward in time, there's more of a power-centric aspect potentially to these individuals, where the primary focus becomes kind of the king of the castle thing. I'm the king of the castle, you're the dirty rascal. But pretty harsh realities of like ritual, sacrifice, and stuff. And we might see undercurrents of this in modern day, but that was the primary focus in a culture back then, to some degree, with the rigid hierarchies potentially. People do say that like Egypt didn't have slavery, and that might be true, but I think nevertheless there was rigid hierarchy enforced. More harsh in places like the Mayan culture and these sorts of things. And then as we march forward, 10,000 years ago, more towards 5,000 years ago, we start to get the great religious traditions proper, kind of curbing the impulses of the previous system, where the previous system was highly impulsive. This is kind of, as a value system, it's more, I sacrifice now for the greater rewards later, the afterlife, typically, in most religious traditions. So very rule-abiding, very law-enforced in these kinds of structures that impose greater order and greater sort of beauty, in a certain sense, to the world, if done right. Each of these have biological, sociological, and psychological constructs that correlate. So it's not just one aspect. Although we talk about it in this particular sense about values, it has these other cross-correlates. As we march forward to the 17th century, we get, in essence, the Industrial Revolution with reason. They look at the world as sort of this giant mechanical clock, that if we just know how it functions, we can make magical or amazing things happen. Not magical, rationally amazing things happen. In that sense, the locomotives or the automobiles, this is using and putting that empirical scientific reason to work. Achievement and sort of drive kind of is like a primary focus in that space. And then in the 1960s, we start to see, although there's lots of undercurrents of problems here, in the 60s we see sort of the movement of pluralism or relativism, which is kind of this notion that I, as an empirical observer, have flaws. I don't have a perfect analytical landscape. I'm not going to be able to accurately map the world out perfectly. Everything that I think has this biological flaw kind of built into it. So therefore, your truth is different than my truth, and her truth is different than your truth, and so forth. In its most extreme sense, it's kind of this well, Trump calls it a swamp, and I think that's fairly accurate. And it gets pathological and sick and terrible in many respects, as it has so often in the government and so forth landscape. So that pluralistic landscape, therefore, makes the impetus for something that is monumental, if this theory is right. It's a monumental leap in meaning. This monumental leap, if it's right, has a pattern shift that correlates or cross-correlates with the beige system. So the beige system was that first early survival mode, but now we have a survival mode on a global or planetary scale, a survival mode in which, in essence, we are in sort of a highly connected and interconnected environment in a way that those early tribal people weren't. Okay, so this doesn't have the kinds of cycles that you might be thinking about in the presentation that you've presented, but just bear this out. The spiral dynamics model says that for example, that theological position ought to be included. To be healthy, you don't exclude these different waves. You transcend them and include them. It's what you might call a holarchy. Our body has cells which transcend and include our organs, which transcend and include our body transcends and includes all of that in some sense. So these different structures or ways of thinking in many sense are embodied in a bigger and bigger body in a certain kind of metaphoric sense. And so we don't just throw them out. In a healthy way, we transcend and include them. Okay, so this notion of that starts to emerge potentially in and around now, where, and I'll get more precise about this, but in and around now, in that it's requisite to survive in this new environment where our finite resources are bumping up against a wall and apparently seem to be sort of starting to collapse in on themselves, potentially. And so this new survival mode might have to, unfortunately, get kicked back in to deal with these complex issues. Okay, so if that is true, then this new system that's emerging might be considered something like functional flows. So we flow with the environment, we adapt and innovate to deal with the complexities that we are facing. It's sort of a simplified version on the other side of the complexities that we had to face before, maybe something along those lines that wasn't phrased well. But, so, if this is true, then, there's a lot of parallels to that earlier system. So this is something that got me thinking, which I call fractal dynamics. So this is pretty heavy philosophic, but I will get back to a story, hopefully to be more entertaining down the road here in a bit. Okay, so fractal dynamics has layers upon layers of this theory. I, for example, have cells. I have matter first, then cells, then a reptilian brainstem, then a limbic system, then a complex neocortex, okay, right? So these are 5 different systems built on top of each other, if that makes sense. One wave atop the other. In that sense, and this is going to sound weird, but I kind of have 5 brains. So in the psychological tradition, there's a notion of the triune brain, which is kind of a 3-brain model. That's usually considered the reptilian brainstem, the limbic system, and the complex neocortex, and they kind of sit on top of each other, one embracing the other to some degree, each providing what seems to be higher orders of cognitive function. So if in this way, if you look at, say, a reptile, it might be, in a certain sense, I-aware, that is to say, ego-aware in a certain kind of sense, but not ego in the sense that it has an abstraction of itself. It's not complexly ego-aware. It's I-aware in a very simple kind of I sense. Before that, there's not even that. So like a plant life doesn't even have the kind of ability to fight or flight for itself, to really adapt to the situation very much. It does adapt, but not in a very complex way like a reptile. So that reptile dominates its environment. So in that sense, it was like the third system that I presented in spiral dynamics. This is where the fractals kind of start to come in. The third system in spiral dynamics has this idea of power gods, or, you know, dominating in like a Mayan context of ritual sacrifice, killing people for power and these sorts of things. The previous system is vegetative, so it's like our plants and stuff. And that system in the higher fractal in the human context, and it's a very far distance, so it's, you know, the context is, you know, but that would be the magical reality. How can I put it? The shamans very much, the early shamans seem to very much imbibe like mushrooms and these sorts of things and get psychedelic experience. And they worship nature in that way, where the vitality of the world around them was almost not separable from themselves. So that vitality is the quality in which magic might be considered itself as magic, quote unquote. Prior to that, we have survival proper, which would be a fractal correlate with matter. In the higher well, I don't know how to explain it, but its primary focus is survival in humans. I can't say it differently. So matter seems to be surviving nothingness. In that sense, it's the absolute ground from which everything needs to be built. It's the foundation, and it has the hardest work to kind of keep itself as itself in a certain sense, although it has the greatest, what you might call cosmic groove, or the greatest amount of patterns through time to keep itself the way it is. So it has the least amount of change. It's the most unnovel thing potentially in our universe. Think of gold or copper or silver. It stays what it is forever, whereas humans are very adaptive, constantly changing, very novel. Okay, so as we march into mammals, which would be the fourth system, we like the limbic system in that sense, which mammals have, they start to have a caring ability. And this is an ability to be open, emotive in a certain sense to another. Not, again, in a self-reflexive way like humans are, but in a way in which they're at least able to not like kill their young like reptiles do, right? And then humans have this abstraction capacity, but it's very monological. It's very singular focus typically for most people, and it tends to be very good in analyzing like, for example, scientific problems in the modern age, and only in the modern age. You go back a couple 100,000 years ago, it wasn't necessarily that good, but that's been the primary focus for a long time, it seems, if our history is even remotely accurate. Might not be. I know you've talked about that maybe not being the case. So humans, anyways, are moving potentially into what I call the sixth fractal. And I know this is all woo-woo kind of in some sense, but I think it will make more sense as I march forward with this. And that is to say that in this sixth system, and we're going to get to, you know, Fifth Avenue in a bit here, if I do this right, you know, Trump Tower, or Kushner's Tower, is that this sixth system, if it does march on the way it seems to be marching on, might be either a mutant brain, something that we grow, an AI brain that we attach to ourselves, or what have you. In that sense, it's like the sixth brain, is what I'm trying to get at here. The sixth brain is the stacking fractal in which our body has been self-producing, but the fifth system, where we analyze scientifically and build artifacts, we're actually creating the sixth brain through our artifact creation. We're building it and then stacking it on our head, potentially. And I'm not saying this is the right or the good thing to do, but this is probably the way that we as humans will go with it, because that is a possibility that humans would like to probably take, for better and for worse. They would become more conscious, they'd become more aware, they'd become more awake, potentially, or they'd become more dominated if we don't navigate these waters right. The most difficult waters to ever navigate, if my theorizing is accurate. So that's the sixth brain. We're building it right now, and it has a fractal correlate with the sixth system in spiral dynamics, which is pluralistic or multi-perspectival, or, in a better way, interobjective, where the previous system is objective, the next brain is interobjective. The previous four brains, so that would be the sixth brain, the fifth brain, the fourth brain, the third brain, the reptilian brainstem up, have these sort of primary focuses that shift from subjectivity to intersubjectivity, objectivity to interobjectivity. This has a few different flip points, polar reversals, and so forth. One of which is subjectivity and intersubjectivity are, one is singular, the other is plural. Subject, so it's like I and we, like singular, plural. And then objectivity is also singular, and interobjectivity is plural. That would be considered, in many respects, it and its. Okay, so then you can look at in another way, and I'm going to stop this video in a sec. The I and the it are both singular, and the we and the its are both plural, but the I and the we are interior, and the it and the its is exterior. Okay, I'm going to stop.